Hi everyone, it's Ruby G.
And I'm Joff.
Welcome to Truth in Neurons.
Happy Thanksgiving to all of you who have joined us on the channel.
We can't hold you forever.
Can I still go home for Thanksgiving? These 7 words, spoken by Bethany Funke to Officer Noons on his arrival at 1122 King Road on November 13, 2022, is revealing. On the surface, the question appears jarringly inappropriate. A young woman asking about holiday travel plans while standing at the scene of a quadruple homicide where 4 of her housemates lie murdered. To the uninformed observer, it might seem like evidence of shock, dissociation, or the kind of cognitive fragmentation that extreme trauma produces. But when we examine this statement through the lens of linguistics, behavioural psychology, and the full contextual timeline of events, a far more disturbing picture emerges. This was not the confused, excited utterance of a traumatised victim unable to process reality. This was a calculated opening move of someone whose primary psychological imperative, after 8 hours of decision-making, was to establish her exit strategy from a situation she'd chosen to not escape from earlier.
To understand the Thanksgiving question, we must first establish what Bethany Funke knew and when she knew it. Court documents reveal a communication timeline that fundamentally contradicts any narrative of innocent ignorance. This is a tactical coordination between 2 people who know they are in immediate danger. They both attempted to contact all 4 victims. None of the victims answered, and then inexplicably silence. No 911 call came until 11:58 a.m, nearly 8 hours later, and it was placed not by either surviving roommate, but by someone else, reporting an unconscious person. When Officer Noons finally arrived at the scene, Bethany Funke's first verbalised concern was whether she could still make it for her Thanksgiving travel arrangements. This was not a question born of shock occurring minutes after discovering bodies. This was a question asked after 8 hours of deliberation, decision-making, and psychological calculation about how to manage an impossible situation.
Perhaps the most damning piece of evidence in understanding the Thanksgiving question is the physical architecture of the house itself. The front door, the primary exit to safety, to neighbours, to help, was located directly outside Bethany Funke's ground floor bedroom. When Dylan Mortensen received Bethany's instructions to run and down here, she had to navigate through the house past his readily accessible exit to reach Bethany's location. Let that sink in. When both young women knew something horrific was happening, when Dylan had just seen a masked intruder, when Bethany was instructing Dylan to run, their exit to safety was immediately available. Turn right. Less than 20 feet away, unlocked, leading to a neighbourhood with houses on all sides, full of potential help, safety, people with phones who could call 911. They chose not to use it. Instead, they ran towards each other, stayed inside the house that contained both a potential killer and 4 dying or dead roommates, and remained there for 8 hours. This single fact, the accessible exit that went unused, eliminates virtually every innocent explanation for their behaviour. If you're genuinely in fear for your life, you don't run deeper into the danger zone to meet up with a friend. You run out. You run to the nearest neighbour's door, you scream, you bang on windows, you get to safety first, coordinate second. The decision to stay inside the house, to hide rather than flee, to coordinate with each other rather than seek help, speaks to a psychological calculation that prioritised something other than immediate survival. And that calculation, whatever it was, set in motion 8 hours of inaction that followed.
Between the last documented phone activity and 11:58 a.m, when the police were finally summoned, nearly 8 hours elapsed. What happens psychologically during this time frame is the key to understanding the Thanksgiving question. These were not 8 hours of unconsciousness or confusion. These were 8 hours of active decision making, during which two young women who knew something terrible had happened chose to continuously not call for help. Consider the psychological states that would have cycled through their minds. Initial terror and adrenaline, which would have peaked around 4:25 a.m. during the frantic texting and calling. Then, as minutes turned to hours and no additional threat materialized, the acute fear would have begun to transform into something else. Mounting dread as silence from the roommates stretched on, increasing certainty that something catastrophic had occurred, and perhaps most significantly, escalating awareness of their own inaction and what it would mean when help finally arrived. As dawn broke and daylight filtered into the house, they would have faced a psychological reckoning. The longer we wait to call for help, the harder it becomes to explain why we waited. Each passing hour would have increased the psychological weight of their decision not to act. By 8 a.m., they had been sitting with this knowledge for 4 hours. By 10 a.m., 6 hours. The guilt, the fear, the confusion about what to do, all of it compounding, creating a psychological pressure cooker. And somewhere in those hours, they made additional decisions to call other people to come to the house rather than calling police themselves, to have those people discover the bodies, to create a layer of separation between themselves and the official report. By the time Officer Noons arrived, Bethany Funke had spent 8 hours managing not just trauma, but the consequences of 8 hours of choices. The Thanksgiving question was a product of this crucible.
Looking at linguistics, Can I Still Go Home for Thanksgiving is a masterclass in strategic communication designed as innocent inquiry. Let's deconstruct its components. First, the auxiliary verb can indicates a request for permission from an authority figure. This frames Bethany as subordinate, compliant, and seeking guidance.
Multiple observers who have reviewed Bethany Funke's police interviews note a striking contrast between her presentation with law enforcement and her presentation in social context. In police interviews, she consistently employs what witnesses describe as a 5-year-old's vulnerable voice, soft-spoken, mumbling, with patterns of a much younger child. Her body language is uniformly closed in a huddled position, wearing a hoodie and jeans, carefully desexualized clothing, minimal eye contact, physically contracted as if she was trying to make herself smaller. She cries gently, enough to signal distress, but not enough to become incoherent or lose composure. She answers only the specific questions asked, volunteering not much additional information, maintaining strict linguistic boundaries. This presentation is remarkably consistent across multiple interviews over time, suggesting it's not a temporary trauma response, but a maintained strategic persona. In contrast, her social media presence and photographs from before the murders show a young woman who presents as confident, assertive, even sexually provocative, posing in underwear and bras at clubs, displaying dominant body language, projecting a different self-image. This dichotomy is significant. While people can certainly behave differently in different contexts, shifts between dominant sexual confidence and childlike vulnerability sometimes suggest either significant personality fragmentation or sophisticated impression management. The fact that the vulnerable child persona emerges specifically and consistently in interactions with authority figures suggests the latter. Research on police interview dynamics demonstrates that certain presentations elicit more protective, less suspicious responses from investigators. Youthful appearance equals perceived innocence. Soft speech patterns equal traumatization rather than evasion. Closed body language reads as fear rather than concealment. Minimal verbalization appears to be the result of being too traumatized to elaborate rather than strategic information control. However, whether Bethany Funke consciously adopted this presentation or whether it emerged from unconscious self-protective instincts, the effect is the same. It creates an interview dynamic that discourages aggressive questioning and positions her as a fragile victim rather than a potential source of concerning information. The Thanksgiving question, delivered in this carefully maintained persona, becomes another data point in a consistent pattern of self-presentation designed to minimize scrutiny and maximize sympathy.
The 8-hour window between the murders and the 911 call, Bethany placed a call to her father, who is a dentist, reportedly to discuss a toothache. On the surface, this appears to be another example of bizarre priority inversion, focusing on mundane physical discomfort. This call may have served multiple psychological functions. First, it could represent profound dissociative compartmentalization, where the brain has so completely walled off the horror that ordinary concerns can still occupy mental space. Second, it might be normalcy-seeking behaviour, an attempt to convince herself that life can still proceed normally if she can just focus on normal problems. Third, and more cynically, it might have been a form of coded communication, a way to contact her father for guidance without explicitly stating what had happened, pretty much. Either because she feared being overheard, couldn't articulate the truth, or wanted parental advice about what to do. Fourth, it establishes a documented pattern of normal behaviour during the timeline, creating evidence that she was functioning routinely, thinking about ordinary things, not behaving like someone who knew about murders. Whether this was conscious strategic thinking or unconscious self-protection, the effect is the same. It creates a behavioural record that complicates the narrative of she must have known something was terribly wrong. The toothache call and the Thanksgiving question are psychological bookends. Both represent Bethany's brain reaching for normal life, normal plans, normal concerns, as if normalcy could somehow override or erase the catastrophe unfolding around her.
After analysis of the linguistic content, temporal context, physical layout, communication timeline, behavioural presentation, and psychological patterns surrounding, can I still go home for Thanksgiving? The conclusion is unavoidable. This question was not primarily a symptom of trauma, shock, or disassociation. It was the opening statement of a self-preservation strategy developed over 8 hours of decision-making by someone who had chosen not to flee when flight was possible, chosen not to call for help when help was needed, and now facing the consequences of those choices. Bethany Funke spent 8 hours in a house where 4 people had been murdered, with an accessible exit she didn't use, surrounded by neighbours she didn't alert, holding a phone she didn't use to call 911. During those hours, she experienced not just trauma, but an escalating awareness that her inaction would require explanation. She knew that when authorities finally arrived, there would be questions. Why didn't you leave? Why didn't you call? What did you see? What did you hear? What did you know? The Thanksgiving question was her answer to all of those questions, compressed into one strategic utterance. I'm just a normal girl with normal plans, trying to figure out if this terrible thing that happened to me will disrupt my life. I'm not someone who made choices. I'm not someone who has things to hide. I'm not someone you need to scrutinize. I'm just asking if I can go home to my family for the holidays. It positions her as a passive recipient of tragedy rather than an active decision maker during crisis. It deflects attention from her 8 hours of choices by focusing on future logistics. It projects innocence through its mundanity. This doesn't make Bethany Funke guilty of murder, but it makes her guilty of something the public narrative has never acknowledged. Prioritizing self-interest over victim welfare, managing personal consequences over moral imperatives, and presenting strategic self-preservation as helpless trauma. The exit was there, she didn't take it. The phone was there, she didn't use it. The neighbours were there, she didn't alert them. And when the police finally arrived, she asked about Thanksgiving. That question, in its perfect distillation of self-focus, reveals the psychological truth that 8 hours of choices had already made clear.
Well, the toxicology reports, right, they usually take 4 to 6 weeks, sometimes longer, but they might, I don't think they're going to be relevant in the actual manner or cause of death.